Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning into this session on the environmental realities of the digitalization of government. My name is Victoria Adelment, and I'm the Director for Technology and Human Rights at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at New York University School of Law. I'm leading an ongoing research project at the center called The Hidden Environmental Costs of Digital Government Transformation. And in this project, which has really inspired today's session, my team and I are conducting research into the environmental impacts associated with the widespread digitalization of government, and we're investigating the legal frameworks that will be needed to shape the ecological trajectory of digital government. We'll be publishing our in-depth report on this topic later this year. I'm joined by a fantastic group of speakers who are working at the cutting edge of topics surrounding digitalization and the environment. But we're also keen to get a sense of who's in the room with us and to learn from all of you in the audience today. So please introduce yourselves in the chat. Tell us where you're joining from and what you're working on. We'll be sharing some prompts in the chat throughout the session, so do share your thoughts with us and feel free to ask questions in the chat at any point. So to introduce our panelists for today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Grace Akese, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Universiteit Beirut, focusing on geographies of e-waste. She's a discard studies scholar within the African Cluster of Excellence. We're also joined by Paz Peña, who's an independent researcher, consultant, and activist, and an expert in the relationship between technologies and the climate crisis. She's just published a book about these issues. And she's the coordinator of the Latin American Institute of Terraforming. And we're joined by Gauthier Roussille, who's a researcher focusing on the environmental impacts of digital technologies. He's also a consultant and scientific expert for several public institutions, including the French administration. Now, this session sits at the intersection of two key topics. On the one hand, the rapid digital transformation of government, and on the other, the environmental impacts of digital technologies. And important research and advocacy efforts are happening around both of these key issues separately. And in this session, we're going to bring these two topics together to critically explore this intersection. And so the plan for the session is firstly to map out the environmental realities that the digitalization of government entails. And secondly, we're going to discuss some paths forward. And in the next 6 minutes, I'm going to make some introductory comments to frame today's conversation. I'm going to set out the digitalization of government, outline the environmental impacts of technology, and then make the case for the importance of bringing these two fields of study, and crucially the movements focusing on these issues, together with one another. So first, what do we mean by the digital transformation of government? Governments all around the world, with the encouragement and support of international organizations, multilateral development banks, and consultancies, are enthusiastically adopting many different kinds of digital technologies across their operations and across their services. So many governments are developing enormous digital identification databases, which cover entire national populations. Many are using algorithmic decision-making systems to determine eligibility for services like welfare. In some instances, governments are deploying more complex machine learning and predictive systems to try to detect national security threats or detect fraud in public services or quote unquote predict where crimes are likely to happen. And many governments, as we know, are using widespread biometric surveillance across their territories and crucially, especially in the context of border control. And the pandemic accelerated these developments, and it's also accelerated a transition to ensure that government services can be accessible remotely. And so we're moving towards a future where individuals will interact with their governments through websites and online portals, maybe having to scan a fingerprint or scan their face in order to access key services. So all this to say that the digital transformation of government is very widespread. For years, scholars and civil society, including our own team of researchers at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice, and many of those here with us at this RightsCon summit, many of us have been documenting how government's embrace of these new technologies implicates human rights and inflicts costs, especially on marginalized groups. So that's the digital transformation of government. Meanwhile, environmental advocates, indigenous groups, communities on the front lines, and also software engineers and others have been highlighting the environmental harms associated with digital technologies. And these harms are really severe. The ICT sector is projected to be responsible for 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions by 2040 by some estimates. And of course, mining for the materials in electronic hardware is having destructive impacts. But a lot of these discussions have almost exclusively focused on private industry, and particularly on the environmental footprints of big tech companies. And that focus on the private sector is, of course, understandable given the enormous environmental footprints of just a few large technology companies, and also their role in driving all of this. So in collecting more and more data, in creating demand for better devices, and so on. And also some of this work on the environmental footprints of big tech companies has come from individuals who worked inside these companies and did groundbreaking work in raising the alarm. So many of you in the audience will be aware of that research, and you might question why we're focusing specifically on governments. And so in framing today's session, before we go to our fantastic panelists, I want to put forward 3 key reasons for which we should pay greater attention to the ways that government digitalization is contributing to global environmental harm. Firstly, the environmental realities of the digitalization of government require our attention because of the size and the scales involved, both now and also in the very near future. So I've talked about how governments are deploying computationally intensive systems in the context of borders and policing, and how they're developing identity databases containing data on hundreds of millions of people. And so the storage capacities, the energy usage required are already very significant. And some of the world's largest data centers have historically been government data centers. Crucially, when we look to the near future, we see that this scale is only going to grow. So many governments are working to further integrate databases, to collect more data on individuals, and to deploy more complex systems. All of this, of course, relies on vast physical infrastructures made up of electronic components whose life cycle and supply chains entail many different environmental harms across many different geographies. But this brings me to a second reason to focus on governments. These physical effects are being obscured. Governments' official digital transformation strategies, so where governments set out their plans to make services more convenient through digitalizing them, for example. These strategies generally don't mention the environmental implications of these digitalization ambitions. And in fact, they often proclaim that digitalization will help governments reduce their physical footprint. And even more tangibly, some of these narratives suggest that the digital governments of the future will be presenceless. So the government of India, for example, has been working towards, I quote, presenceless, paperless, cashless service delivery by government, and services are being built on top of what's called a presenceless layer. And this language is used in many other countries as well. The imagery is that of the ethereal, with government becoming a platform, moving to the cloud, and transcending territory and physicality to exist in the virtual space. And these narratives are really obscuring the material realities of the future of digital government. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, a third reason to focus specifically on the environmental impacts of government digitalization concerns the particular role of the state. Governments play a key standard-setting role, and they'll therefore shape future practices. When they take action to mitigate the environmental impacts of their own digitalization efforts, this will have knock-on effects across markets. And so with all that said, and without further ado, I want to turn to our speakers so that we can start to map out some of the environmental realities. So let's first go to the very beginning of the life cycle, the sort of beginning of supply chains of digital technologies. Paz, you've done really important work on the topic of mining and extraction of materials needed for digital technologies. Can you introduce us to some of these environmental harms? So when we talk about digital government infrastructures, what resources and materials are we talking about here? What are the harms arising from the extraction? Where are those harms felt, and who bears these harms?
Thank you, Victoria. Happy to be with you, with Grace and Gautier. I think it is important first to clarify that what is problematic here is not necessarily digitization itself, which certainly has socio-environmental impacts, but rather, I think it's more important to examine the economic logics that dominate technological development today. That is why, for me, it's clear to speak of techno-capitalism than only of, technologies or digital technologies. And in particular, it is, I think, a question of analyzing how the extractivist logics of capitalism in digital technologies have socio-environmental impacts, no? So techno-capitalist logics is the one that dominates technology today, whether developed by the private sector or the public sector. So that is its logic of data extractivism and the idea that the connection must be more intensive to capture more data. And all that has a correlation with the social environmental impacts throughout, the production chain of technologies. So specifically referring to extractive mining, we must remember that the minerals sustain the existence of devices and the electronic infrastructure of digitization, no? So for example, with all its components, a smartphone needs all the periodic elements, all the periodic table elements to exist, no? So certainly it does not need large quantities, but what matters here is to analyze the big picture or the scale, as you said, Victoria, no? That is that in the 21st century, economic hegemony is being defined by those who dominate two major fronts: the generation of green energy and the generation of cutting-edge digital technology. That is the geopolitical fight today. And it so happens that both transitions, energy and digital transitions, need the same minerals. So today we're facing a mining boom that has particularly put a new weight on the mining countries of the global south. This boom is also driven by the need to accelerate the phase out of course, of fossil fuels to meet the climate goals we have, but also the need of Western countries for mineral suppliers that are not dominated by China, or, for example, to eliminate the Europe's dependence on Russian gas, etc., etc., etc. But what I mean is that mining dependence by techno-capitalism can only be analyzed by thinking about the geopolitical scenario of the 21st century. And this mining boom, driven by techno-capitalism, has brought, at least I will say, two crises. One, a human rights crisis. Think, for example, of the dominance of the Democratic Republic of the Congo regarding a fundamental mineral for digitization, such as cobalt, no? And how there is an, ample evidence that the extraction of cobalt is underpinned by child labor, no? Or in Brazil, for example, illegal gold mining in the Amazon has ended up exterminating members of indigenous populations. So there are concrete public complaints about how the big technology companies, for example, have used this cobalt and illegal gold mining in the Amazons, for example. But the mining boom has also driven a social justice crisis, even when mining companies complain with human rights standards, no? So we see it in the South American lithium triangle, no? The most important lithium reserve in the world, where its extraction, that is based in hydraulic mining, has ended up displacing indigenous populations who have no water to sustain their, millenary existence. But it's also about the disappearance of unique biodiversity, no? With the excuse of the digital and green transition, which is by itself so contradictory, no? Who is bearing the costs of being green? So to end my intervention, the question here that we need to ask is who benefits from the economic fruits of digitization led by governments in this 21st century? who should bear the cost of the infrastructure needed to deploy this techno-capitalist digitization led by governments, and how our governments assume those responsibilities in their own technological developments. And I believe these questions, at least from the mining extractivism, have been absolutely absent of the conversation and the discussion regarding governance digitization. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you very much, Paz. That's so helpful in outlining already some of the global dynamics that we're talking about here and thinking about the crucial questions of who benefits and who bears the costs. And it's also great that you've pointed already to some of the geographies at hand. So mentioning the DRC, the Amazon, the Lithium Triangle. That's really great. I want to stay on that subject of geographies and turn to you, Grace. You're a geographer specialized in the movement of so-called e-waste, which refers to discarded electronic products. And so we've just talked about the beginning of the life cycle, and I wonder if you can now take us to the end of that life cycle of these technologies. And can you tell us as well what the environmental harms arising from e-waste are and who is especially bearing those harms? And then secondly, could you help us by mapping some of the geographic flows of e-waste and some of these kind of geographic spaces as well that we're talking about?
Sure. Thank you again, Victoria. I think I'm quite excited already. Paz has said quite an interesting tone, and I think it's going to be a really wonderful conversation. So looking at the end of the life cycle, specifically with electronic waste, what we see is that these devices often contain toxic and heavy metals and dioxins that are very harmful to humans. And for example, lead, mercury, and cadmium has been identified as really key elements that, when exposed to humans and the environment, has really dire environmental and public health implications. But what is more important in the context here is that often when electronic waste are broken apart or recycled under certain conditions, they are more susceptible to lead to really grave environmental implications, especially for marginalized populations. And here, I think the pathways of exposure are mainly we have airborne exposure, but we also have waterborne, and more recently, research is even establishing that these toxicants often travel through food chains. So we are really literally consuming these dioxins. And as I noted earlier, very often marginalized populations, those involved in so-called informal recycling of electronic waste, are those who are bearing the burden of these environmental catastrophe. For example, in my own research, I've been looking at the infamous Agbogbloshie sites in Accra, Ghana, that some of the audience may be aware of. And for the past 12 years, the site has received quite a lot of international attention, and rightly so, because it's really a space of rampant toxicity. It's in your face kind of thing. And there are some of the environmental NGOs who are leading this work have actually conducted toxicological studies that is showing sometimes 100 times the background level of lead, for instance, in the soil at the site. And this is an area too that is really heavily populated. The Agbogbloshie site, for instance, houses about 80,000 people. So you can imagine the level of exposure that we are talking about. So I think it's clear that electronic waste, when recycled under informal conditions, really poses critical health and environmental implication, often to marginalized people who are pushed into these sectors, in part because of lack of economic opportunities that they face. Yes. And I think your second question was regarding the geographies of flows of these materials. On that, I think for a very long time, the dominant storyline around e-waste as a crucial public health issue, but also even the policies that have come out of it, kind of suggested this unilateral flow of these materials from the so-called global north to the global south. And within this, I think it was even suggested with regards to some of the advocacy work that was done by environmental NGO, that as high as, I think, 60 to 90% of global e-waste production makes its way to developing countries, to places like Agbobloshi. So this is the dominant framing that circulates within this sector. However, as part of my work as a geographer, but also others who are actually mapping this flow and following it with actual field work, what we are observing is that the patterns are not so unilateral as you would imagine in these flows, and that majority of the flows that actually happens between so-called countries of the global south. So you would have flows from Asia to Africa, for instance, happening, and even within Europe itself. So you would have regional kind of trades in these materials happen. But what is even more interesting, and is happening now, I think, in the context of our conversation today about digital governance and its intersection with the environmental realities that we want to highlight, is that developing economies themselves are producing their own e-waste as these countries kind of develop and also embraces these digitalization efforts. So it's inevitable that I think research projected that by 2030s, developing economies, so countries in the global south, would be the largest generators of e-waste as they embrace these kinds of policies. So we are yet to really see the bigger scales of these issues, and that would actually change the policy environments that I think we've imagined in the past, and the kind of policies that have come out from global e-waste issues more generally. And I think that's something that probably would come up in the course of conversation as we do this. So I would end my interventions here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Grace. And absolutely, I think this question of deconstructing some of the narratives here and thinking about how certain forms of storytelling are shaping policymaking is something that we're definitely going to be delving into more in the rest of the conversation. It's also really helpful that you touched on size and scale in talking about, you know, where exactly is lots of this e-waste coming from, and again thinking about the scale at hand here. And I wonder if we can delve a little bit more into this question of scale and size again, and sort of measurement with you, Gautier. Could you help us to set out more concretely some of the specificities of government digital infrastructures? So, you know, you've worked as an advisor to public institutions regarding the environmental impact of digitalization, and you've also done some really interesting work on the calculation of environmental footprints. So could you paint a picture for us of some large-scale government digital infrastructures and the physical footprint underlying them? And if I can just add on to that as well, what would you say is especially special about the environmental impacts of digitalized government specifically?
Okay, thank you for inviting me, and I'm very happy also to share this conversation with all of you. So maybe I will emphasize the point that Paz already made when she intervened. It's really hard to try to sort out what is public and what is private sector when you look at digitalization as a whole phenomenon. So I try to do this exercise to try to set out what could be the public set of footprint in that context. Normally, when you look at the issue of total footprint of digitalization, you will look at a three parts system. So you have data centers from one side, telecommunication networks, which include fiber, 4G, 5G, satellites, and end user devices, whether it's for personal or professional use. The data center parts have been increasingly private, and less governments are actually relying on their own data centers. So there's kind of an escape from the public sector to managing data centers. But it also depends on your policies regarding sovereignty and for each state, because we know where those big data center operators come from, and there might be also geopolitical issues as putting your workloads, your computing, your storage to a private actor as from the state. Networks is originally where the state was the most involved, or at least governments was the most involved, because they will be the primary investor in setting up large-scale networks. When it comes to making a phone, like just a phone network originally, or nowadays fiber networks for depending on the country you are at, but also to massively subsidize the development of mobile telecommunication, such as 3G, 4G, and nowadays 5G, and end user devices. So obviously, very little states are producing. I mean, almost no state is now producing end user devices for its own use. Maybe because I'm French, the only thing I can think of is Minitel, but it was 30 years ago. But the public sector and governments are a major purchaser of end user devices. So they have an enabling power, as they have a purchasing power, to say how much do we order and which services we're gonna also order that will function on these devices. So normally devices is a mixed case between public and private sector, but it's also one of the biggest lever for public sector, because most of the footprint, when you look at the ICT sector in itself, comes from manufacturing and user devices, because that's where we're producing the most stuff. Data centers come with a lot of issue and a lot of on specification, but it's also constrained to a specific set of factors. Now, when we look at devices, I think we estimate that there is maybe 34 billion devices active today, and a large part of that is IoT, Internet of Objects. But even if you look at smartphones, globally, the industry is shipping around 1.3 billion smartphones a year. And that's because the scale of this production, that most of the footprint today is held on the manufacturing part of devices. So that's the main lever on which government or public sector tends to work. But there is also one part of the public sector that is completely hidden and does never be accounted for in any evaluation of the ST sector footprint, is the defense sector. We have absolutely no idea what part of ICT goes in there. And I mean, we don't have much of a carbon footprint of any army, I guess, today. And we also have to look, to remind ourselves that a large part of digitalization project are also linked to defense projects. So there is one part of the footprints that we are not seeing today, and we are not likely to see soon. So I also want to remind the limits of looking at ICT in the public sector in that case. But also there is another issue, is that even if you are digitalizing a public sector, public services, and providing connectivity through networks or through access to devices, we will not destroy all physical public services, because they're still here, and actually we need them. We cannot think that we're going to make all our digital services fully digital. That's it as a mean to destroy the physical alternative. So in that case, a completely presenceless digital government will never exist, I think. And it's more like stacking two layers. You need to maintain a physical layer of accessing to public services, as it's your right as a citizen, and also try to control what kind of digital layer you're putting on your public services, that will never be enough to provide universal access to all your citizens. So in that sense, we are through digitalization also a part of the government government footprint is increasing, because we are stacking. We are not always fully replacing.
Thanks so much, Gauthier. And absolutely on your final point, just to echo that, I think some of the work that we and our partners have been doing has focused on a lot of the costs and the harms that have come from governments trying to move to a digital-only approach. But it's harmful and unrealistic to suggest that you would close down all of the kind of brick and mortar offices, and we absolutely still need both of those. It's also very helpful that you've already started out there by setting out some of the key challenges here, especially the difficulties of separating out the private sector from the question of government digitalization, given the extreme reliance of governments on the private sector throughout the entire life cycle of technologies. And a kind of part of this enmeshment as well between the public and private goes back to this question of narratives that we were talking about, where some of the kind of push that's happening and some of the ways that governments are trying to sort of digitalize and digitally transform often also are sort of inspired by or come from the private sector as well. So I want to go back to this question of narratives that you had mentioned, Grace, in talking about the question of kind of dominant storytelling and how it has shaped advocacy work specifically and thereby shaped policies. So we've seen how some governments present their digital transformation as sort of presenceless. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the role of kind of narratives and silences that you've seen in your field of work, and also maybe address who you've seen pushing these narratives and how it's shaping policymaking in this field.
Sure. I think when it comes to the e-waste field, as it emerged as a really policy priority worldwide, the key responses around it has been on banning international trade in end-of-life electronics, in part because the dominant narrative that has emerged from this discussion has been one of the global north, as I said, dumping its waste on the global south. So you have key legislation such as the Basel Convention on the transboundary movement of hazardous waste, for instance, being one of the key treaty that I think came into force in 1989. No, it was initially put forward in 1989, but then it was put into force in 1992, and later on in 1995 there was an amendment to the convention that specifically dealt with electronic waste, because the whole convention deals with hazardous waste, which electronic waste is considered as a component, and led by the Basel Secretariat and other environmental NGOs. What these organizations, I think, imagined, the kind of geographical imaginaries that shaped them was this division of vulnerability. So you have the ban amendments in this regard, kind of developing countries into two main blocks, what it calls Annex 7 and non-Annex 7 signatories to the convention. And what it argues is that flows from Annex 7 countries, which mainly consist of the EU and OECD plus Liechtenstein. So these countries, they are banning flows of electronic waste from them to any other territory that is a signatory to the convention. So within this context, one of the powerful narrative that has been pushed within this policy context is one that somewhat imagines all developing countries or all non-Annex 7 countries, as the convention would imagine, as equally vulnerable to flows from the global north. So it imagines a geography, for instance, where because it's kind of following this narrative of dumping, where a country like Ghana is vulnerable in the same way that a country like China is when it comes to dumping of waste. But we know that is really not the case in reality. So I think the bigger point here is that in a push for environmental justice and to kind of drive attention to the unequal distribution of harm that comes from e-waste processing in informal economies and informal settings such as agbobloshi, there is this narrative of dumping that has shaped the whole policy arena in ways that we are having policies that are coming out from it that imagines a geography that's no longer relevant. So as at now, for a very long time, the Basel Convention, for instance, didn't have enough signatories for it to come into force, but very recently it did have, with the signing rectification by Croatia. So you have an international policy that is no longer relevant to the reality on the ground, because even if you ban flows of e-waste from Belgium to Ghana, China, for instance, might ship its e-waste to Ghana, and you're not governing that trade in that regard. So there are still, I think, what is crucial here is that there are narratives that shape the policy directions in ways that it puts some solutions on the table and then took others off. The fact that developing countries are generating their own e-waste, the fact that digitization efforts are actually really being pushed forward in these developing economies, and as such, they would be developing their own electronic waste and would have to find ways to manage them safely. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Grace. That's really important and interesting point. I want to stay on the issue of policy making, if that's okay, and turn back to you, Gautier, given your work in the public policy sphere. So I want to ask you about the present and the future of policy initiatives, if that's okay, and specifically on digital government and sustainability. So firstly, on the present, this isn't an entirely empty landscape when it comes to policies. What are some of the policies and governmental actions that have already been put in place regarding government's digital sustainability? And then secondly, what is the future of this? What do you think needs to be done to better address the issue of digital sustainability in government moving forward?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So I can speak mostly from the point of view of France, because as well I followed most of his work. There has been a lot of legal actions that led to the publication of a new law in France called Reducing Environmental Footprint of Digital Sector. That was signed and published in November 2021, and it followed previous laws that was set up in France, like anti-waste, circular economy bill, and so on. Most of this legal work is focusing on reducing waste coming from digital devices, include enforcing refurbishing, or at least enforcing for public administration to include to buy refurbished devices for its own agents. It also includes more education programs, including teaching eco-design principle to computing students and computing engineering students. It includes also something that came to life recently, the repairability score, where the government set up a list of criteria that in a form that manufacturers will have to provide, and will get a score according to the details they provide on the product. And this score is now publicly displayed on every product in shops to guide consumption habits. Also in 2024, maybe 2025, we'll go further with the durability score, which includes not only repairability, but if what you are shipping is also made to be lasting, is meant to last, which include also criteria, and also will be a public-facing label, also to inform consumers. There's been also a push towards to design sustainable websites, and especially sustainable public services, which is a big topic to get in, but it means basically to be more conscious of the footprints related to using public services, but also to be an extra lever to push other virtuous stakes when it comes to digitizing public services, such as web accessibility, privacy, and so on. So it's not, you should not see co-design as something in isolation. It's something that tries to work together to make a better digital environment for citizens. And I could continue the list, but maybe I will stop also here. One last thing is maybe I'm forgetting my point here. We have quite a lot of policies, so I'm trying to get back on what was my last point. Also, yeah, for cities, no, every city in France that have more than 50,000 inhabitants should present a sustainable digital policy roadmap for the city and for their constituents, including new purchasing policies, better sourcing of devices and of softwares associated to that, and overall to have more of to open the prospect of how do we make public or collective decision making on what should we digitalize within the city and within the services of the city.
Great, thank you so much. And that's really helpfully already touched on some of the questions that are coming in through the chat as well. And I do encourage the audience to continue to send in questions. I want to turn to you, Paz, for a final piece before we turn to the Q&A. And we've talked a little bit about the sort of silences in the narratives and the problems with the current ways of thinking about issues and some of the challenges. In your first answer, you talked about the sort of logics and ideologies that are underlying some of this. So I wonder if you can kind of pick up on that again and maybe try and sort of end on a more positive or at least hopeful note to think about what kinds of challenges we might need to overcome, but also think about a call to action to those who are listening to this session. So you've been working with civil society organizations across various movements for many years, and you're a leading figure discussing environmental justice within the digital rights community. So what do you think the role of civil society can be in addressing some of the challenges that we've talked about?
Wow. I think civil society has the most concrete opportunity with governments to hold them accountable for the environmental impacts of their digital systems. No, so for example, earlier in this year in Uruguay, an academic used the Escazú Agreement, that is the regional agreement on access to information, public participation, and justice on environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. Is the Escazú Agreement. And this academic used this agreement to force the Uruguayan Ministry of the Environment to disclose the amount of fresh water that will be used by a mega data center built by Google in some city in Uruguay. No? And although a huge draw is hitting Uruguay as a country, the Uruguayan Environmental Ministry did not want to release the information on Google's water use because it simply adopted Alphabet's position on classifying the use of water in its data centers as a corporate secret. So this academic not only won in the Supreme Court, but the ruling used the Escazú Agreement to say, among many other things, that water is a good of public domain and interest. Basically, the contrary that alphabet is saying. So this example shows, I think, that not only we must hold governments accountable, but we can actually do it. We can actually use instruments, legal instruments that are already invented, designed to basically understand and hold governments and big tech accountable about social environmental impacts, especially, for example, in the global south. So I really believe that I know it's sometimes difficult to think in good news in the shape of the world today, but I do believe that if we can actually build bridges between these two movements, the digital rights movement and the social environmental movement, I think we can actually have very positive outcomes, especially because of the experience field in each of the movements. No, so I think the Uruguay example is a very, very interesting example to actually study and to basically copy in the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. That's excellent and wonderful to be coming back to very tangible hooks and legal frameworks that we can be using. That's really helpful. We've had some questions from the audience that would specifically talk about the kinds of legal frameworks. I'm going to read them both out, if that's okay, and then put them to all of you. So firstly, from Jilali Taya, to what extent could public procurement regulation be appropriate for tackling the growing environmental footprint of digitalization? Would you by any chance have any examples of this type of regulation somewhere in the world, and mentions regulations in France? And then we also have a question again about legal frameworks from Avis Momeni. How do we tackle the regulatory framework to be really implemented in the field? We observe that one of the main issues is the implementation in the field. How can we involve local authorities at the local level and in the context of decentralization and household actors and companies? Is it okay if I go straight back to you, Paz, as you were talking about some of the legal frameworks here yourself?
Well, I think I do believe that local governments are key. Not governments that are based in territories are key for actually deploy accountability around the use of technology. And for me, actually, one key issue that we have to push is basically the idea that there are more options that techno-capitalism to deploy governance digitization. No? And for me, what we need to do actually is try to push for public policies and territorial policies that respond to techno-diversity. No? More different and diverse ways to think about digitization and digitization led by governments, not only adopt the idea of techno-capitalism to deploy these systems. And I think this is something that it's super concrete to push forward. And I think it's something that maybe there's also a lot of examples. I'm thinking in Latin America, I'm thinking about community internet connections, different systems that are deployed by feminists, etc. Different ways to see digitization that are not actually copying that techno-capitalist logic, and that is techno-diversity. And I think we need to push for governments for that kind of policies that can deploy different ways to think about digitization. And I think local governments are key for that.
Thank you. Gautier, go ahead in answering this question about examples and public procurement.
No, I was wondering that, I don't know, I think besides some policies that we have set up in France, I was trying to look for examples in other countries. And I didn't came with some examples. And it took me back to another question, that why can't we see that much public procurement regulation? on these footprints. And my guess is one of the major lock-in that we have, and that is locking this kind of reflection out of the picture, is the deep belief in many governments around the world that digitalization can help reduce environmental footprints. So whatever the footprint is, it will have more positive impact than negative impact. Obviously, when I'm saying that, it's a very macro scale picture, and it doesn't account for territorial realities of pollution, of exploitation, and so on. And since there's too many governments or political bodies that think that by default digitalization is helping towards ecological transition, we cannot see that much policies coming out. But as a reminder, I would like to remind everybody that we actually don't know. We actually don't know if digitalization can help towards ecological transition. And that's kind of the consensus that came out from the latest IPCC report, is that we actually don't know if digitalization helps. So whatever happens, either we can find positive impact, or we cannot just find any. We need to look for these footprints anyway. And because of that, we also need to put some constraints on the development of digitalization, in many sectors, but also on the public sector.
Thank you very much. Grace, could I put these questions to you as well, and specifically the question about implementation in the field? As someone who's really been doing a lot of field work and sort of looking at how these things play out on the ground, I wonder if you could speak to that element.
Yes, sure. I think when it comes to e-waste, especially, and I think I like what the second question about local authority involvement there, in part because what we've seen in countries such as Ghana is this importation of policy from elsewhere. So you have within the field of e-waste, for instance, policies such as extended producer responsibility, EPR schemes actually being very dominant in how businesses have been pushed to handle e-waste. So EPR scheme, basically the idea is to incentivize producers to change their production practices to make products that are more repairable, that are more durable, that are more recyclable, if they are going to have to bear the cost of these materials when they get to their end of life. So in the West, that's the policy that it's very dominant there. So you have businesses being pushed to really enforce take-back systems where after your MacBook, for instance, gets to its end of life, Apple, for instance, would be forced to take it up from you to kind of foresee its recycling in the future. So, but what we've seen is that when these kinds of systems are imported into contexts such as Ghana, they tend to not work, in part because you have an informal sector that is already doing some of these recycling practices, although in very kind of rudimentary ways that are very harmful to the environment. So I think for me, the direction here is to not kind of what we see with EPR is that it wants to scrap a whole system that is doing something, although in problematic way, rather than transforming the system, rather than actually equipping these informal sector workers to really do this work, but do it in an environmentally sound way. So for me, in places like Agbogbloshie, in Accra, Ghana, if we are thinking that developing countries themselves would produce their own e-waste, and that they would be forced to actually deal with this e-waste, and it wouldn't be the responsibility of the so-called global north to come and rescue them. And here you see the, I think, typical white savior syndrome working in, and countries being represented in very passive way at play. I think this is really developmental rhetorics that we know, but we need to find, I think, local solutions that are being actually proposed by people who actually are dealing with these environmental realities, rather than importing them from elsewhere and trying to implement them.
Absolutely, that's so important. And that, again, very nicely segues to another question that's come in from Jeff Doctor, who says, isn't digitization usually just further entrenchment of colonialism? And how can we link indigenous land and water protection efforts with this rush to digitize everything, especially with AI hype that we're seeing now? We only have a couple minutes left, so if I can have a volunteer who'd like to address this question.
Well, I'm not quite sure if we need to engage indigenous communities. I think indigenous communities and land defenders already know what is happening with this mining boom and etc. No, and I think actually that the action will be to us, like digital rights practitioners or technologists, to actually go and engage with them, no, not in this power position, but also to learn what is happening in territories, because the fight is already happening. No, it's not something that is coming in the future. It's already happening. The social environmental impacts of technologies are happening all over the world, and I think it's super important for us to go there and try to learn what is happening and try to actually to build these bridges, but very respectfully in terms of what the actually populations are actually happening and suffering.
Absolutely. Gautier, would you like to come in on that as well?
Yeah, so obviously I cannot give any insight on indigenous communities, but I will just take the AI thing out of the question by saying like which kind of technologies should be more worrying than others. And I mean, in the case that which kind of technologies, digital technologies, are supposed to have an impact that should make us worried in terms of environmental impact. There is at least two things you can keep in mind: is does this scale? And in the case of AI, AI in itself has been there for a while, but here it's the implementation of generative AI or large language model within like Microsoft Office or within the Google Suite that will reach billions of people, and hence that will create a demand for new capacity of computing, of storage, of networks, and so on. And in that case, will have are most likely to have an impact due to the capacity to scale within a business model that is set up for aggressively scale. So always think of yourself: is it worth looking at a digital technology, and why? So does it scale? Does it have a business model that is looking for scaling? And what kind of material needs are needed to make this technology scale? And also another little quote, this reflection is: when we think of environmental impact, we really tend to look at carbon footprints, or counting carbons, or counting energy consumption, or counting even water consumption. But it's not that much that environmental impact that we need to look at, but more what we've been talking about since one hour is territorial impact. What is that directly happening on the land? What are the conflict of views that are created by new infrastructure, by whether those are mining infrastructure or data centers? And data centers will be a very hard things to put. I mean, putting data centers somewhere now is more and more controversial because it creates more and more conflict of views, such as was saying in Uruguay. And it's the same in Germany, it's the same in France, it's the same in Ireland. So there will be much more, we should put much more focus on the local conflict that are also created by this kind of infrastructure, and also to look at the environmental footprint, but not just one or the other.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for bringing us back again to the role of resistance as well, especially of people on the front lines. I'm afraid that brings us to time. I want to give a huge thank you to Grace Akese, Paz Pena, and Gautier Rossi, and all of you in the audience. Thank you so much for all of your comments and your questions and your engagement. Please do get in touch with us if you want to participate in or give your views on this ongoing research project on the digitalization of government and its environmental impacts. Huge thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.